All right, this is a hard slide because I'm just going to talk. I'm sorry, I did think in hindsight I should have probably done another video or something, but anyway, let's just go. All right, when we're working out the questions, it's not that easy, all right? Some of you have already asked me, how many questions for 20 minutes? It depends. I really can't tell you. I advise you to have between 6 and 7. However, some groups do decide to do a compulsory set of questions and then an optional set of questions just in case. If you ask closed questions, do you have a mobile phone? Well, that's much quicker than saying, what do you use your mobile phone for? You're going to get a much longer answer. So this is why it's impossible to say how many questions you should have for a 20-minute interview. It's impossible to know. It depends on the answers you get. All right? So the other thing is that you need to also work out the questions and then go back to your research question. This actually happened in the tutorial yesterday. Some students started writing down interview questions, and I said, well, that's a bit different from what you're after in your research question. Do you want to change your interview question or your research question? And the answer is you can change your research question. If you think that when you start writing out the interview questions, you actually are starting to hunt for different data, then change your research question, because there's something going on. The other thing that also happened yesterday was some students were struggling with their interview questions. They were quite closed. And I said to them, yeah, but look at your research question. And the research question was closed. So their minds were in a place of, I want a yes-no answer. So when they started writing their interview questions, they were yes-no answers. Not helpful. Must be open at some point. It's okay to have closed questions to start off with. It's a nice way to guide people in. It's a gentle way of building rapport, all right, which I'm going to talk about a bit. But you've got to be careful at some point to have open questions. And of course, then there's the probing questions. Now, for Assessment D, this is why I'm saying you might like to have some additional questions. You may want to do a decision tree, depending on what you're doing with your research question. You might, for the interview, say, if they give us this answer, we will go on and ask these sets of questions. If we get this answer, we'll do these sets of questions. I've seen some students do it. It is a lot of work, but if it makes you comfortable, do it. There's no harm in doing it. You can try and guess probing questions. Probing questions are normally things like, could you expand on that? I'm not quite sure I've understood. That's interesting, could you explain further? All those sorts of questions are probing questions. You're asking to get more information out of them. All right? If they shut you down, then that's a different problem, right? No, I don't want to add anything. Well, if you want to elicit more information, okay, I understand that you don't want to add anything, but it's important that I'm really clear on where you're going with this. I've understood that you mean this. Have I understood you correctly? Yes. Okay, and are you sure there's nothing else you'd like to add? Oh, all right, now I'll add something else. Okay? So the probing question is really important. You can preempt them a little bit, but they are more on the fly. So you're going to have a degree of comfort about that interviewing process. All right, and obviously this is why you test the questions to make sure they work, and you'll test them on each other. Okay? Now, sampling is always a problem in interviewing. It's one of the hardest things to do. You would have seen last week that Milgram advertised for people to participate in his experiment. You can advertise for people to interview. You know, you can put signs on the back of toilets doors and ask people to be interviewed for various bits and pieces, or put posters up, or put an advertisement in the newspaper. You can do that. Another one is that you can actually, you pick your demographics so you know where they are. So you're going to interview a particular group of people in a workplace, or you're going to interview a particular group of people in a library, or something like that, depending on what your research question is. So your sample might actually be a well-defined, self-contained group of people. That's awesome. Very rare, but awesome if you can pull it off. Depends what your research project is. One of the most common ways of actually getting a sample group for interviews is what we call snowballing. Snowballing is a technique where you start with one person you know, and you interview that person, and then you get to the interview end of the interview and say, thanks for that. Who else would you recommend I interview? And they'll say, oh, go and interview this person. And you go, thank you. And then you ring up that person and you say, hi, you've been recommended to be interviewed for this project, blah, blah, blah. Would you mind? Oh, no, that sounds okay. I'll be interviewed for that. And then you interview them. You get to the end of that person, you say, could you recommend anyone else? And then what happens is, and this is why it's called snowballing, right? Because you're starting with one and you roll on to the next one, then you roll on to the next one. Quite often people will say, oh yeah, look, I can think of 5 people you should interview on this. So then that's how you get those 5 people. And then you go from there. Pros and cons with how you sample, right? Because remember in the ethics weeks we talked about justice. Have you covered off enough of the diversity of the demographics that you need? So if you feel like you need to get a representative sample of society, then snowballing is really not going to work unless you are quite selective about it. And think of the time that this takes, right? You've got to get through the whole interview, get to the end, find the next person, ring them, arrange, then interview them. So this is time that it's taking you. So the reason why snowballing does work though is that because if your sample group is a particular group of experts or a particular group of people, then the assumption is that those people know other people like them. Does that make sense? So, you know, for me, I was interviewing accounting academics. I don't know a lot of accounting academics, but accounting academics know accounting academics, so they could recommend their colleagues, so they did. Okay, it's the same if you interview somebody who's interested in a particular type of music. They've probably got a friend who's also interested in that type of music, and then you just snowball those people who are interested in that type of music. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is just to advertise, can I have all metalheads, you know, I want to interview you, please, can we do that, thanks. And do an advertisement in the Canberra Times, or to do an advertisement on Facebook, or all sorts of different ways you can find people these days. But you do have to think about your sample. All right, if you're asking people about particular things and all that sort of stuff, your sample group is really important because it will change your data. Your sample set's important, all right? Okay, so you've got to then organise the interviews yourself. Okay, you will find this for assessment D. You've got to find your person, but then they work on this time, you work at that time. How are you going to find times to do an interview? Okay, it's a pain, it's horrible and it's horrendous, but you've got to do it. So you've got to set aside not just 20 minutes, because if for assessment D it might not take 20 minutes, it might take 40 minutes. Don't make it take 40 minutes, a transcript will take you forever. But you know, you can't just say, it's going to take me 20 minutes. So you can't just back up your interviews when you're doing your research. You've got to have the gaps in between. It's all got to be convenient, all that sort of stuff, okay? So this is the things we have to do. This makes you then have a choice about synchronous and asynchronous. So sometimes if you're interviewing somebody overseas, so for example the lecture here in week 12, I'm actually using an academic who's currently in the Middle East. So she and I have had to negotiate a time that suits both of us with the time gap, and we're actually going to do it through Skype because I needed it to be synchronous because I didn't want it to be asynchronous. We did talk about that. We talked about whether or not she'd just record her responses, like I'd send her the questions and she'd just record her responses. That's asynchronous, and that's a fair way to collect data. There's no problem with that. But I wanted it to be synchronous. Having said that, I've sent her the themes of the questions that I'm going to ask her. She wanted for the themes, and then I will ask her direct questions. So it's exactly the same as you guys are going to do for assessment D. You're going to tell them the themes that you're going to ask them about, then you're going to ask the questions. Okay, this is how we do it. Asynchronous means that you can then, they can really plan their answers. I personally think that's a different type of data than interview data, but the research says, no, 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 you can do it that way. I think if people have crafted their response to you, they've had much longer to put it in writing, they've really thought about it, they've shaped themselves. When you ask people questions, particularly when you ask them a range of questions that lead them to a point, by the time you get to that point, you're going to be getting a very honest answer if you've done it well. Okay, so we ask a sequence of questions that guide them in. We've got to build the rapport. We've got to have a relationship with them. So we sit them down in a nice environment. We don't sit on top of them. We might buy them a coffee. We make it relaxed. We ask our questions gently, usually closed questions to start with, then we move into the open stuff. Or you ask them personal questions. Your first question for an interview can always be, how's your day been? Because once they start to give you information in response to a question, they will keep responding to all the questions that you ask. And then you ask them the question that you want to ask them really, and by that time they're so comfortable with you, they're going to give you an honest answer. Either that, or you'll see it physically in their face that they're not giving you an honest answer, and then you ask all the probing questions you can. This is one of the reasons why I want you to do this face-to-face in Assessment D, and also why I prefer synchronous interviewing than asynchronous. I just don't like it. I just think people lie better when they can shape their results. And people always lie, okay? We all do. So, you know. Okay, so then it's obviously the transcripts. This is the most boring bit in the whole world. You will find this. You're going to record your interview, then you're going to play it back on half speed, and you're going to type like a crazy person to type across everything that they have said. Either that, or you're going to spend the money and get somebody to do it for you. Okay, there are lots of people who do this. But if you are going to use somebody to transcribe it, you have to tell them in your consent form, right? Because it means there's another person who's going to see the data. So you actually have to say, this will maybe given to an external party for transcription. You have to tell them, because it's their information, right? So transcribing is literally putting what was said on tape into a document. When you transcribe, some people will also put down sigh, laugh, pause. They'll actually put in what actually happened. And in fact, there are experts in this who will actually video record interviews, and they'll put expressions in as well. And there's a real technique to this, and then their argument is that it really changes the data. You know, because it's that whole thing of yes and no's. Yeah, I'm fine. Okay? Mixed data. Why are you shaking your head if you're saying you're fine? But people do it, right? Start watching people. It's fascinating. So these people are actually experts in their field, and when they transcribe, they've got a whole bunch of symbols that tell them when a head shook or nodded or when they played with their face. Oh, yeah, I suppose. You know, hand gestures are really, really important. For Assessment D, I just want the words. Don't get carried away. Please don't get carried away. Your life will never end. Transcribing is really time consuming. If you can't touch type, it is the worst thing in the world. Do playback on half speed or even quarter speed if you can put up with it, but quarter speed, the words tend to get a bit weird. Half speed I highly recommend. If you can touch type, you'll pull it off. Okay? It's going to take you about an hour and a bit to do 20 minutes, depending on how you go. You actually write down your question and their answer. You've got to redo everything that was said. Okay? Put laughter in if you've been sarcastic or indicate that it was sarcasm. Otherwise, transcripts can read a little hard. Just tip for young players. Okay, analysis. All right. Interviewing is a method, it's not a methodology. The methodology is how you analyse it. Remember, the data to knowledge. So data, knowledge, information, wisdom. The step to knowledge is the analysis. It can be discourse analysis, which means you're doing a thematic analysis. So once you've done your transcripts, what were the themes that came through for each person? Then what are the themes that are consistent across the people? All right. The second reading this week talks a bit about how you do the cases. And that's the analysis that they're talking about there. The one that I keep yelling at you all about is comparative analysis. You can't do comparative analysis for Assessment D because your sample group is 2. That's not enough to do comparative analysis. However, if you've got a sample group of 20, you can. Right? You can start doing some comparisons. We found that, you know, women said this and men said that. All right? Tends to be survey data rather than interview data, but, you know, you can do it with interviews. The other one is narrative analysis. What's your story? What's the actual story you're being told by the interview? What's going on? What's the narrative? All right, so then you have to come into the analysis. For some of you, when your interviews might go terribly wrong, in which case your analysis will be about method. And then your paper becomes a method paper. So remember last week where I talked about defining your problem? Is it a method problem, a theory problem, or an empirical problem? Sometimes it's a method problem. So you might come back together and discover you've got nothing in common at all. That's a method problem. So then your paper becomes, well, this is what we did wrong, this is why it didn't work, this is what we do different next time. And that is viable research. There is a lot of research papers out there like that. Really good research, highly recommend it. Okay, so don't be worried if your interviews go wrong. It just means a different type of analysis. So don't stress it. The word saturation, we throw it around. I've thrown it around before. I threw it around with the literature review. It's about how do you know when you've got enough? For you guys, you've got 2 interviews. That is not enough. All right? Not enough. The word saturation is something we throw around in qualitative research because it's a handy way of saying you know you've got enough when you know, which is a bit glib, but it's true. You know when you've got enough. The answer is, you know you've got enough when there's nothing new. So when you interview the 4th person and they're saying exactly what person 1, 2 and 3 said, you're starting to think, okay, then person 5, then person 6. Studies have been done that show once you hit 12 people who are consistent in the data they're giving you, you've hit saturation. If you've learnt nothing new in 12 people, you're doing good. So you can stop. So 12 is kind of the magic number. Some people argue that's still not enough. Some people suggest that 12 really, 12 opinions. How do you know that's saturation? How do you know there's nothing new out there? Well, the answer is it's qualitative research. Of course there's something new out there because somebody else will think differently. But the point is eventually you reach a point where you're really not learning anything new. So you can start to make some analysis calls. There's some themes coming through. There's consistency. And so we call it saturation. Basically, and that's what we do in the literature review as well. You keep reading until you're learning nothing new or until they start citing each other. And it happens. And depending on what your research topic is, the volume is different, which is why you can't say exactly how many. But in interviewing, we say it's about 12. All right, this quote I find quite interesting. I also do like William. Anyway, moving on. When you do your interviews, and when you try and use the tricks that I'm going to teach you in the tutorials next week, you'll find yourself learning a little bit about you. You'll also find when they give you answers to questions that you thought were obvious and they're struggling with them, you'll learn that the way you see the world is different from the way this person sees the world. So you'll learn a little bit about you. That is okay. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to have this process as learning about you. We do say in the social sciences, you'll never do a research project and come out at the end as the same person. Every social science project you do changes you because it changes a little bit about your truth, right? Because you see your truth a little bit differently to everybody else. And then when you do your research, it will just shift you a little bit. Not a lot. I'm not going to say it's going to be earth-shattering, but you will think a little bit differently. Don't be afraid about that. Embrace it. Work with it.